The United States is a country at the center of the universe and it's beautiful. Oh wait, did I say the United States? I meant America. In the year negative of billion, the United States might not have been here. In the year negative 40,000, it was here, and you could walk to it. And some people walked to it. And then it got warmer, some icebergs melted, and now America's by itself. Except a couple of other countries, but they don't matter. So these people were called Native Americans. And they lived here, 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 and here. And they were all friends. Ding dong, it's Spain, and France, and Holland, and Britain. Please trade with us, they said. And so they brought over their horses and guns and Jesus, which they exchanged with plants, edible plants like corn, potatoes, and tobacco. Then the Native Americans were like, yay, we have guns now, let's kill each other. But then the Europeans were like, how about we kill you with smallpox? And they did. And then they took their land and tried to live there, but then some of them died. The people in Britain saw that these people died, but they didn't care because they wanted gold and silver. So they sailed over, and more of them died. And then more sailed over, and then more died. And then some religious people came, and these people didn't die because they were pure and God was on their side. Soon enough, British people came, said that there were 13 colonies divided into 3 regions. The north was cold and filled with God's people, while the south was filled with slaves, most of them not God's people. All the middle colonies did was farm. Britain looked at these colonies and said, do whatever you want. Correction, do whatever you want so long as we get some raw goods and hard cash. And then they made a law. Breaking news, Britain is at war with France, and so Britain asked the Indians, be our friends, and the Indians said, we're not friends because you're not friends with our friends. But Britain won anyway and took more land, or the colonists took more land. Britain tried to draw a line because, all you need to do to stop people from moving is to draw a line on a map, but the colonists didn't respect the line. Unfortunately, war requires money, so Parliament said, let's tax the colonies. For what? Said the king. Everything, said the Parliament. No, the colonists said, but the king didn't hear that, so they protested it by sending a petition to the king, and also throwing some tea into the ocean. When this didn't work, they declared independence. But then Britain said no, and war happened. And surprise, Americans won, against all odds. With the help of France, of course. After Britain was gone, the people made their own government. We don't like taxes, went the Americans. So they wrote the Articles of Confederation and didn't let the government tax. But then the government was poor. And so some people called the Federalists said, let's make a new constitution. No, said the Anti-Federalists. Let's do it, said the Federalists. No, the Anti-Federalists said a little bit quieter this time. And so the new U.S. Constitution was put in place, and it made the government govern more. After 8 years, the President George Washington was really done with the U.S. government, so he told everyone, stay neutral, don't rip each other's throats out. And then he was like, bye, because he wanted to get a life. What do we do now? The Americans whispered. Ding dong, it's France. Take this land for .00001 cents, said Napoleon. Okay, said Thomas Jefferson. And so America was now twice as big. And this time, the British king felt that it would be fun to bother America, again. And he was also at war with France, again. But Britain needed money and sailors, so what do? They kidnapped some Americans. What are you doing? The Americans asked. Said Britain. And so they had more war. But then they stopped and signed a paper that said nothing would happen. After the War of 1812, people didn't fight for 9 years, but then they did. Over slavery. So they drew another line, because lines solve everything. Then a guy named Andrew Jackson became president. People liked him, until he became president and then screwed everyone over. Jackson gave people tariffs in South Carolina and said, no, stop, what are you doing? We can't export cotton like this. So Jackson went, okay, and lowered tariffs. That's better, said the South. I'll just kill the second bank of the United States instead, responded Jackson. No, said Henry Clay. That sucks. This sucks. So the president destroyed the bank, which didn't work out very well, but who cares because Jackson does what he wants. He did that and then he wanted to feel even more cool, so he said, let's move some Indians. No, you can't just go and kick Indians off their land, wailed the Supreme Court. And Jackson said, how about I do anyway? During this time, religion came back again, this time with reform movements. Let's give African Americans and women rights, said the Americans, and stop drinking, and improve schools, and improve asylums. Or at least they tried to, but it was all just a dream. But you know what wasn't a dream? Manifest destiny! And so Americans went to Mexico for more land because Mexico had land. They fought a war. The U.S. took some of this land after the war and called it the Mexican Cession after Mexico. Can you maybe chill, said Mexico. How about maybe you chill, said the U.S., and then the Mexican government sort of collapsed. By 1850, it was clear that the line they drew after the War of 1812 wouldn't work out, because California wanted to be a state, but if California became a state, then there would be more free states than slave states, and the slave states didn't like that. The free states looked at the slave states and were like, how about you let California do what it wants? But the slave states wanted slaves! So these two guys came along and made a deal, and another one. Then Lincoln became president, which South Carolina didn't like. Oh, and Mississippi, and Florida, and the rest of the South. And then this other guy tried to make a third deal, but the southern states said no deal, and left the Union. And then the whole country broke into pieces. Actually, 2 big pieces, the North and the South. At first, the South was winning, but then the North started winning because of this guy. And then they started fighting over slavery because if they freed the slaves, the southern states would have no slaves. So now who's going to win the war? Vote now on your phones. And everyone voted so hard that the slaves were freed. but only in the South. Now that the war was over, people tried to give black people rights by making some laws, and discrimination never happened again. Psych, screw the laws. After the Civil War, the U.S. could industrialize again in a post-war economic miracle. Some people who worked in factories, other people who worked in the jungle. Some people didn't work, they owned the factories and integrated business into very large corporations. From this, they got big money and big power, which made people sad because they didn't have big money and big power. Pay us more, work us less, chanted the people, and so they made a cool kids club like this one, which failed after the police killed some protesters. Since that didn't work out, they made another one that was more like a clique because only skilled laborers could join, which did work out, kinda. In 1892, some random farmers realized that they also didn't like very large corporations, so they had a convention where they wrote this list of stuff that they wanted and made a party. They even nominated a guy to run for president, but then the group kinda just died. Now because America had money, it was time for them to start conquering stuff, but stuff had already belonged to everyone else. Good thing the USS Maine happened to be conveniently blown up in 1898 because of Spain. Just kidding, it was because the USS Maine decided to spontaneously combust. But who cares? So they go to war and America can now steal some stuff from Spain. But what does that mean? America should take these islands. They conquer Cuba and Guam and Puerto Rico. They also free the Philippines. The Filipinos said, yay, we're free, but then US saw them and said, nah, and so they had more war and conquered the Philippines. It's time for World War I. All the countries in Europe were having a war because some dude in Serbia shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But Americans didn't want war. They wanted war without the war. Then Germany was a jerk and started sinking people's ships, which made America upset, so America joined the war. But the war was pretty much over, so America didn't really do much, but they got lots of credit. President Wilson made a list of 14 goals to convince Americans that the war was worth joining. He said, let's make these 14 goals a thing. Nah, said the rest of the world. But then they saw one of the shiny goals and thought it was cool. So the League of Nations was created to keep peace in the world, but America didn't like it because President Wilson had a stroke and couldn't convince them that it was cool, and it died pretty fast. They also punished Germany a little. After World War I, most of Europe was destroyed, but America wasn't destroyed, which was just the right recipe for another post-war economic miracle. People started making cars, and boxes that kept food cold, and boxes that wash your clothes. And there was also consumerism, where everyone started buying stocks. Everyone who could afford to buy stocks bought stocks. Poor people who could not afford to buy stocks did not buy stocks. Then in 1928, the stock market crashed and there were no more stocks. The economy was now trashed and it was pretty depressing, like, greatly depressing. To keep the people less depressed, some guy came along and said, let's make a deal, how about some socialism? And the people said, okay, but only because they were poor and needed help. And it helped, kind of. So they re-elected this guy for 4 terms until he finally died. It's time for World War II. At this time, World War II, the sequel, opened in theaters in Europe because Germany kept invading people, but this time they had more friends, like Italy and Japan, and everyone's favorite, Slovakia. America didn't feel like joining until Japan blew up some boats in Hawaii because why not? So America joined the war. This was good for America because it made the economy not trash and the country less depressing. Because that's how you make a country less depressing. You join a war. So the United States goes to war in Europe and helps the rest of Europe chase Germany back to Germany and Japan back to Japan. However, Japan didn't want to go back to Japan. Now, America knew that if they sent soldiers over, they'd die. So they made some bombs and dropped them so people wouldn't die. Because that's how you keep people from dying. After that, America said, wow, that war was pretty bad, but it did make us hella dough off of producing weapons and stuff. So then they helped make the United Nations, which made sure that there weren't any more terrible sequels to World War, because everyone knows that the original is always the best. After World War II, the soldiers came home and boom, they made lots of babies, and then they created boxes that you stare at, and boxes where you keep your food in, and boxes where you lived in. Everyone owned the same boxes because hating mainstream was too mainstream. You know what also became mainstream? Hippies! They were so cool being hip and fashionable by smoking drugs and having sexy times. Those people may have had a lot of fun, but nothing could compare to the fun that the African Americans were having. The Supreme Court had decided that they were subject to separate but equal facilities, which were pretty separate but pretty unequal. So these African Americans sat at some lunch counters and on some buses, and ultimately they led to a nice speech and a nice law. And all blacks lived happily ever after. While this was happening, the Soviets were expanding. We're expanding, the Soviets said. Shoot, America said. And so containment was created so that the Soviets who were expanding would stop expanding so fast. But Soviets kept expanding and America kept saying, no, stop, what are you doing? Until people started calling this a Cold War. Which wasn't actually a war. Instead they kind of just glared at each other the whole time and it was like a game of Chubby Bunny. With combustible marshmallows. And America was like, hey, look, we have an atomic bomb. And the Soviets were like, hey, look, we have a bigger atomic bomb. Even though they didn't have a war, there was still war. The leader of North Korea, the Soviet Union, decided it was a good idea to invade South Korea. But this pissed off the United Nations, who decided that it was a good idea to invade North Korea and China. But this pissed off the Chinese, who decided it was a good idea to invade South Korea, who decided that an armistice was a good idea. So they drew a line. But the Americans still wanted more war because communism was bad and it needed to stop, especially in Vietnam. Knock knock, at the door, it's the United States. Contain communism, America said to Vietnam. Stop having it be spread. Which Vietnam are you talking about? The Vietnamese screamed. So the United States sent people to check out what was happening, and also to make sure they still seemed cool to all the other countries, because credibility is the #1 priority. Americans thought the war was going really well until it wasn't, and then they didn't want to have war. But the presidents liked their credibility, so they kept having war until Daniel Ellsberg was like, what are you doing? And the president said, oh no. Then some guy Nixon got elected as president. How did he do that? Oh, he sent some guys to creep on the DNC. And, wait, what are you doing? Said the police. Nothing, said the spies. It's just a bizarre incident, said the president. So the police were like, cool, but then they found some tapes which basically said that they were doing something, and so Nixon resigned and ran away. Sometime later, the Soviet Union died because the new leader wanted friends, but all the Soviet republics didn't want to be friends anymore. The Soviet Union broke into pieces. You've got mail. It's from Russia, the new leader of Russia, and he's trying to make his economy not suck and needs friends. So the United States and Russia decided to be friends, and to this day, the US has had no better friend than Vladimir Putin. During the 1980s, the American president was Ronald Reagan, who introduced Reaganomics, which made the economy better, kind of, until the guy who created Reaganomics said, oh yeah, by the way, Reaganomics is fake. Oh, Reagan said, After that, the United States started to have a lot of fun in the Middle East, giving weapons to terrorists, creating terrorist organizations, regretting life decisions, fun stuff. After him, we had 2 pieces of shrubbery as president. They did some stuff, I guess. I just want you to know that when we talk about war, we're really talking about peace, Bush Jr. said. Amen. In between the Bushes was Bill Clinton, who did not have sexual affairs with that woman, because whether or not a president has sexual affairs with a woman is more important than stopping Al-Qaeda, which led to them needing to build a new World Trade Center and making the Pentagon a Pentagon again. In 2008, just as the economy was becoming trash again, America elected its first African-American president, who did do some stuff even though Congress didn't want to do stuff and basically shut down the government once or twice, because shutting down the government solves everything. I guess things are still pretty cool, though. I mean, the 2016 presidential election is pretty rad. Just gotta build that wall to make America great again. Bye!